So for session 4 is focused on new technologies enabling innovative clinical research. We have 2 additional speakers, Dr. Grace Colón and Dr. Elizabeth Kunkowski. These sessions will also focus on cross-cutting challenges in clinical research for prevalent chronic diseases, but we'll focus on how new technologies could help researchers overcome these challenges and consider lessons learned from other disease areas where new technologies have been a key driver of progress. First up, we have Dr. Grace Colón. She is the President and Chief Executive Officer of InCarda Therapeutics. In addition, she is the Executive Chairman of the Proterix Bio. Dr. Colón has over 25 years of experience in biopharma, genomics, and healthcare, as well as industrial biotechnology. The floor is yours now, Dr. Colón.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen here. Can everybody hear me okay? And can you see my screen? Bettina? Okay. Oh yeah, you're muted. Okay, no problem. I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's been a really phenomenal session. And I think you'll see that I'm actually going to touch upon a number of the topics that have been addressed by each of the speakers this morning. And what I'm going to do is actually share briefly sort of 3 case studies or 3 ideas of how we can think about innovation in a more holistic way. So not just a single new drug or a single new diagnostic, but how can we begin to integrate some of the issues that we saw today and take technologies, put them together, and then in a value-based way, create better outcomes for patients while saving resources and really advancing treatment in these huge unmet medical needs. And so I'd like to, let's see, I'm not getting into advanced. There we go. So the 3 examples that I have today have to do with atrial fibrillation, so resolving acute episodes early to reduce the AF burden, which is not really possible today as early as we're hoping to do. IPF, which is a significant unmet need disease where new treatments have come to market, but they still have significant challenges, and COPD. And I'm going to take you through 3 brief case studies in these areas. So to start with, just real quick, a lot of these topics have been covered, but this is a report that Bio issued. They actually really focus on highly prevalent chronic diseases. This came out last year and it had to do with cardiovascular areas. And it just, again, highlights in a different view the level of investment against all of these diseases plotted against the annual cost of the healthcare system. So we've talked about these disparities, but I thought this was an interesting view. And then just even in this report in cardiovascular, one of the stark things that they showed was the dearth of new innovation, at least in terms of new chemical entities. When you look at what happened, 20, 30, 40 years ago in, for example, systemic hypertension, or even in congestive heart failure, although recently there's been an exciting advancement with the combination of neprilysin and neprilysin inhibitor and valsartan, and even got expanded indication. That was Entresto for heart failure, where we actually are starting to see more use in HFpEF. And so I want to talk about AF. So incredibly enormous unmet medical need, large patient population. In the US alone, it's about 6 million. And it's a progressive disease where it involves a lot of utilization of the healthcare system and is responsible for a lot of sequelae and really challenging quality of life for patients, even in the early stages of the disease. So many studies have shown a definitive correlation, with stroke and mortality with incidence of AF. And in AF specifically, it's really, many studies have shown that it really points to billions and billions of dollars to the healthcare system, probably over 50 billion if you include all costs. And it's a combination of the drugs that are needed, a lot of healthcare utilization, and then progression to more intractable forms where invasive surgery is needed, which sometimes has consequences, although technology is improvement, and really a stark visual of how much more cost utilization a patient incurs with AF versus without AF. And the issue is that AF begets AF. It's well understood that the more minutes you're in AF, when you start off, you might have 3 or 4 episodes a year. It's really the paroxysmal stage which self-resolves. But the way it's treated today, or frankly not treated, is patients can be in these episodes for minutes, hours, days, up to 7 days. And the cumulative effect of having that results in 8 to 10% progression to the more persistent phase. And so there's really no good, the issue is there's no good treatment options to stop an episode quickly. There have been a lot of antiarrhythmic drugs developed, no new ones approved since 2009, actually, but they're used in IV form. Outside of the US, there are many more drugs available. In the US, there's only one. It's ibutylide that's indicated for this. It causes torsade. It's not used very much. There are other drugs as well that can be used in hospital, but they take hours to resolve. They have, requires hospitalization in many cases. And then oral drugs are available for suppression, but it requires high levels, and there are breakthrough episodes. There's not great compliance. So there's safety and tolerability issues with current forms. So at InCarda, we've developed an inhaled version of a well-known drug called flecainide, where we can show that when you deliver via a nebulizer and a specially developed formulation, you can actually reach, it's absorbed rapidly through the lung, first to the pulmonary veins in the left atrium, and the Cmax is reached just a few minutes after an 8-minute inhalation. And so the effect is there's an opportunity to stop these episodes within minutes, which we believe that if this is approved, it could potentially over time show that you may be reducing progression. You're certainly going to greatly reduce symptoms, hopefully, and also maybe reduce the other sequela. So, the treatment right now is in phase 2. We did an ascending dose study. And in comparison with the IV, which is 100 mgs, 150 mgs when it's used outside of the US, or oral when it's used off-label to stop episodes, it takes about 200 or 300 mgs. We went up to 120, and we see that we can achieve therapeutic levels with this modality just within minutes. And we can see that the average time to conversion in our studies is about 4 minutes, which is really incredibly fast. And so the way you'd use a therapy like this is you'd start by seeing who responds to flecainide. Not everybody does, but you could start in a medically supervised setting, which is how we're carefully developing this. Once you've identified people who respond after the first successful use, you could then hopefully, if it's approved in these broader settings, you could use it more broadly, potentially at home, at work, while traveling. And you could use it again in a medically supervised setting, even before it might be approved more broadly. The point is patients would have a choice and would have an intervention that they could actually use to stop the episode. And now what's really interesting, speaking about integrating technologies, is a lot of people have Apple Watches, there's a live core, a number of new devices, sometimes even software you can download to your phone and works with PPG to see or really confirm if you're having an abnormal arrhythmia. You can confirm with your physician, and then it really facilitates this paradigm, increases awareness, gives the patients more control. I want to switch gears and talk about another example of something similar in chronic treatment. And this is courtesy of Dr. Bruce Montgomery of Avalyn Pharma, where he's working on an inhaled treatment for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, this is a very progressive, debilitating, and fatal lung disease with just a fairly short life expectancy after being diagnosed. And there are treatments that have been approved, really groundbreaking treatments in the past few years, most notably pirfenidone and nintedanib. The challenge with these drugs is they still have significant side effects and result in a large percentage of patients discontinuing the drugs. And these drugs, of course, still sell well. They're adapted because of the huge unmet need. It was certainly a great improvement. But given that they have these issues, what Dr. Montgomery is doing at Avalyn is they are looking at an inhaled version of pirfenidone, and they used a pretty sophisticated sheep animal model to look at the levels of interstitial levels in the lung of the drug to try to identify potentially therapeutic levels. And so the levels they've been testing are really at 6 to 12% of the oral dose, which is 3 times a day. So 800 milligrams 3 times a day. And they looked at 50 milligrams, twice a day, or I'm sorry, once a day, or 100 milligrams twice a day. And what you see is they actually achieved, so far in their studies, they've achieved a significant improvement over current standard of care. And rather than the typical, decline that you see, or reduced decline that you see with oral pirfenidone, they're actually seeing a slight improvement. And again, these results are early. Dr. Montgomery is really an expert on this. I'm not in a position to describe this in great detail, but what I do know is that it's a really interesting example and potentially promising in a severe unmet need. And again, highlights the innovative use of an existing drug with a new modality to change the paradigm and potentially help these patients significantly with a much lower systemic dose and even improved compliance. And lastly, what I want to talk about is switch gears from therapies to diagnosis. As we've talked about this morning, you can't manage what you can't measure. And a disease like COPD is quite complex. It's multimodal. There are a lot of pathways to being activated. There are many comorbidities. And unlike something like diabetes, where you have something like an A1C, you can look at glucose levels, a very clear indicator of disease activity. There's really no good single biomarkers that have really been developed that will really help a physician or a patient really understand their disease or even manage populations that might be higher risk and more likely to exacerbate. And so, for example, a COPD patient that's in sort of moderate to severe stage, they incur significant costs, but more importantly for the patient, this can drive progression, and it's a really terrible experience. You have to be hospitalized. It's really scary. All kinds of triggers can trigger an exacerbation, certainly viral infections and other things, and allergies. And so it's a multiplier condition. So it's a huge impact to the costs to the healthcare system, but it's also really hard for patients. And so the existing ones are insufficient. Part of the issue of managing these populations, I know Colón has talked today about, how do you look at the system holistically and how do you manage populations? How do you identify the populations that are higher risk? It's really hard to distinguish. It's a very large group of patients, and it's really hard to tell. The standard lung function measurements are not really adequate to really manage this, especially over a season or over a year. And so if you're able to develop something, the company Proterix has developed, this is courtesy of Dr. Mike Millo, CEO of Proterix, and disclosure, I'm chairman of this company. They've developed a disease activity score by looking at a variety of inflammatory and immune response biomarkers tied to algorithms and measured against known patient populations, really working with a number of key researchers in the area. And you can imagine something like this can all of a sudden enable both clinical trials to better understand, enable new endpoints as we've talked about, but also allow a physician, a healthcare system to really understand their patient population and monitor it over time. The data are pretty exciting so far in terms of really, for the first time, having something that potentially could become like an A1C, but in COPD. And what you could see is there's a respiratory landscape emerging where you can imagine partnerships within different companies to tie together the elements of measurement, treatment, patient coaching, interventions, all kinds of tools that you can think about that are now being deployed in other areas such as diabetes, where you can start to think about implementing these types of things in something like respiratory disease. And the interesting approach that the company has taken is actually can be expanded to other chronic diseases that are multimodal, where you have lots of pathways being activated, lots of comorbidities, taking more rigorous approach of testing different combinations and algorithms against known patient populations, looking at the effective interventions and other things can really open up new tools. But as Jim was saying, this will require, accepting new endpoints, validating these endpoints. So I think the point that I'll wrap up here with the 3 examples, but the point I wanted to make is we really need to think in a more integrative approach to dramatically reduce this. So as we've seen for chronic diseases, it's not going to be one single drug or one device. These are complex diseases, they're progressive. It really takes a more holistic approach. And then there's really a major opportunity to look at the overall patient journey and at existing treatment paradigms. For example, in AF, where early stage patients are mostly put on rhythm control, or they just sit and wait for an episode to pass. Every minute they're advancing the electrophysiological remodeling of the heart. And if you could suddenly stop that every time you have an episode, we would hope that would dramatically change the patient journey. And so, for example, there's a tremendous opportunity to look at existing drugs, which are proven and lower risk, but might have some challenges in their current modalities. And you could look at new technologies and at alternative routes of delivery. This requires a lot of scientific integration, CMC, formulation development, device combinations, but it also provides development of new intellectual property, which can actually spur investment into solutions like this. And then, as I mentioned, looking at novel biomarkers, integrating other types, not just wet biomarkers, biological biomarkers, but using wearables and sensors, as we were talking about earlier, and then creating new endpoints, maybe new combination endpoints. And then, of course, if you integrate these with all the digital tools where you're getting patient-reported outcomes, patient quality metrics, you now have a system that you can begin to form and think about in new ways in these more complex diseases. So again, this is a perfect venue to be discussing this, because it really will require an integration of science, engineering, and medicine to address these problems together. And as we've heard today, more important than ever, the voice of the patient and equitable access, and it needs to happen at every stage as we think about these holistic solutions. And as we were talking about earlier this morning, it's really about value-based care. Right now, some systems are set up that pharmacy and medical are in silos. And then if you can step back and look at the total cost of the patient, how do you manage these patient populations, particularly in the context of changing, who's assuming that risk and how that might change over the course of a chronic disease. It's a very complex problem, but we need to find solutions and work together to do this. It's really going to require a new level of collaboration, partnership, and sharing. And lastly, as I alluded to at the end, really there's new frontiers in terms of looking at these patient journeys and taking something like a diabetes model and how can we implement these in these more challenging diseases such as cardiology and respiratory. I'm really bullish about that and look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you so we can work together to make a significant difference in these areas. So that's all I have, and I'll wrap up there, and thanks again for the opportunity.